It is Friday, May 10th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Fishbowl episode of LTPS. As always, let's begin with our PS Plus reminder. The May PS Plus Essential lineup is now live on PSN, so you can go ahead and claim those games. But going into our first story, we have more games that are going to be expiring on the PS Plus game catalog that we were not told about, and that's kind of annoying. So if you remember from 2 weeks ago, the last chance to play section on PS5 was updated with 25 games total that are going to expire on May 21st, which would be the most games expiring on PS Plus in any given month since the relaunch, which not a problem, obviously. Licenses do expire, but that was something where 25 games are going to be leaving, a lot of Final Fantasy titles, and then a week later we found out Horizon Zero Dawn Complete Edition would also be expiring as well, and the caveat there being that it's a first-party IP, so why is that game leaving? Kind of feeds into the rumor about a possible remake remaster, but that's all well and good. And so now this week we're finding out 8 more games are leaving, and they're still not actually updated on the console itself where it's part of the last chance to play section. So you would have to find out from either the show or any other source where you're seeking this stuff out. But now you've got about less than 2 weeks to play these games on the PS Plus game catalog. The new ones being Wreckfest, MX vs. ATV Legends. I believe this is all the Darksider games, so the War Mastered Edition, Genesis, and then also 2 and 3. Also Elix 2, where we know the first game was on the original list, so the sequel is on there as well. And then Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning. So again, to circle back, it's not a problem when we have a lot of titles expiring. There's hundreds of games on PS Plus. This is bound to happen. But it's really annoying when they can't at the very least make sure every single title that is going to be leaving is listed on the last chance to play section. I mean, most people don't even know that it's kind of tucked away on the console where it's under the collections tab and then it's on the very bottom of the page. A lot of people don't check that. So maybe we should give that more visibility, and then maybe we should make sure that it's actually updated properly with all the games that are actually leaving. So with that in mind, you've got less than 2 weeks now for the 34-something games, if there's anything in there you want to play, especially the new 8 titles that are also going to be leaving as well. Moving on to our next news story, we've got a rumor about the upcoming PlayStation Showcase, where it's kind of a safe rumor, that being that we can expect the showcase to be announced at any moment. So this goes back to Giant Bomb's Jeff Grubb speaking on the Giant Bomb cast, where he simply mentioned that we are probably going to get this thing announced at any moment. It could be next week, it could be towards the end of the month, but considering we're, nearly at mid-May, it's within that time frame where, if Sony is going to do it next week, then we might see an announcement by, let's say, Monday, Tuesday, then it goes live Thursday. I mean, there are certain patterns that Sony has had historically, so like state of plays tend to have a smaller window, I should say, of when they're announced and when they air. So if it is announced, say, next week, then it would be for the following week. That's at least the expectation there. But this kind of goes into a rumor that broke out after LTPS last week about how Resident Evil 9 might be revealed very soon with a release date next year. And really that's something where Capcom has been historically a very close partner with Sony with, their presentations, right? That being a state of play or a showcase. So a lot of RE games have been on the PlayStation stage in recent years. So we know this thing's not going to be simply packed with first-party announcements, right? There's going to be third-party partners as well. So that could be one good candidate for possibly showing up at this event. And that kind of goes back to the things we can fire off for what we're, I think, safely or at the very least possibly expecting, right? So the Silent Hill 2 remake getting a release date announcement, maybe the same for the Until Dawn remake. Maybe this Horizon thing does show up. Maybe the Horizon multiplayer game shows up. Maybe Sucker Punch is ready to do even just a slight teaser for the next Tsushima game. We know Insomniac, could probably say something. Then there's Concord, so if that game is still going to come out by the end of this year, we have to see more of that. Also, the Astrobot game. There's a lot of things we could see from first party or any of these timed exclusive agreements that Sony has. But third party, if Capcom's ready to talk about RE9, then I think that would probably show up at least from a Sony presentation. So with that in mind, I would expect maybe the last week of May. That's what I was expecting the whole time. But regardless of when this thing does show up, I will say it would be really refreshing to have this showcase finally happen and for it to be a really exciting one. I think sentiment nowadays has been a little bit low, despite there's been like amazing software coming out on a fairly consistent basis. There's so much good stuff to play, but at the same time, I guess the optics don't really look great for the horizon, right? What's coming up down the road. So I think a showcase really will be a timely thing if Sony's ready to talk about a lot of encouraging new things for the back half of the PlayStation 5 lifecycle. Next up, let's go over the aftermath of the Helldivers 2 fiasco, where that mostly came to a resolution on Monday, which we did cover most of that on Monday with that separate upload, so we went over the entire controversy, why it happened, then Sony backing down, so you can go watch that if you want to get a recap on exactly what happened, but the aftermath here is that the game has mostly recovered on Steam from the review bombing campaign, so now the game has 200,000 additional positive reviews, which means the game is mostly seen as positive now from the Steam aggregate, right? Also 50,000 or so negative reviews were reversed as well, so good to see there. But the game is still delisted in 177 countries, so that still has not been fixed just yet. Arrowhead is saying that they're looking into getting this addressed with Sony. Not exactly sure why that wasn't sort of an immediate change on the Steam database side to where Sony would then allow it to be sold, since the PSN linking requirement is now optional. Because, you know, at the time when that happened, again, it was something where that seemed like a Band-Aid fix in the moment, considering the requirement was about to go live on the 6th for brand new accounts. So if somebody did buy the game that day in an unsupported country that can't make a PSN account, then that would be a problem, obviously. So it seemed like a Band-Aid fix right then and there to restrict the buying of that game in all those countries. Because PSN foundationally is not a global storefront, right? I mean, it's just logistically you can't support all those countries right away, not even from a simple terms of service point of view, which that would maybe be the fastest path to getting this sorted, but you can't just launch PSN properly in all those countries that quickly, considering it's again, just a logistical thing with local currency, abiding by local laws, right? That's just how PSN operates. Now, one can make the argument that that's not how Sony should be operating. They should have made this a much more global storefront a very long time ago, but either way, they're still primarily operating in the countries that, you know, from their point of view, they're obviously serving a large majority of the entire global install base at that point. But with that in mind, yeah, I'm not sure why they're not just sort of immediately reversing this now that PSN linking is optional, so hopefully that does get sorted very soon. Now, in related news, we can also mention for Ghost of Tsushima, the director's cut launching on PC very soon, and that one is going to require PSN for the Legends multiplayer, not the single player. But this popped up yesterday, the third-party storefront Green Man Gaming, where they primarily sell Steam and Xbox keys. They apparently started refunding people for this game if they lived in an unsupported PSN country, specifically pointing out the PSN requirement for online. Now, the caveat here, in case you saw this, so this was a little bit misleading, but this was only from Green Man Gaming. So right now there are no buying restrictions on Steam itself, since they're a third-party store. It sounds like they're just trying to get ahead of possibly having to deal with returns if that does come up for them. So on Steam there is no buying restriction, and I imagine there is nothing that's going to really happen for this game. Not only is it probably going to see maybe like a fairly soft launch on PC relative to other PlayStation Studio games, but it's something where it's not required to link your PSN ID for the single player. So it can be sold, and there is a product of value there for those that want to buy the game, even if they do live in a country that does not have proper PSN support. So I imagine nothing will happen. But, you know, it remains to be seen, obviously. The game's not out just yet. But I will kind of say what I said on Monday. It really is seemingly a massive oversight that Sony does want to get into this, you know, what is a very global storefront, Steam. You know, if you're going to do PC releases, why was this maybe not figured out ahead of time for the PSN terms of service at the very minimum, so people can freely make PSN accounts even if they can't officially choose where they reside when making that account? That's just truly baffling. Moving on to a very fascinating interview that came out from MinnMax, where Ben Hansen sat down with Mark Healey, one of the co-founders of Media Molecule, and he left in April of last year, but it was a great conversation, about an hour long, a lot of cool little anecdotes and stories about his time working on the game, his career, LBP 1, 2, going into Dreams, right? So a lot of really cool things that we learned. I encourage you all to watch the whole thing. I'll leave it linked in the description, but at least for LTPS, we'll cherry pick a few news items out of this and talk about what we learned. So during the development of LBP 1 and 2, we found out that a lot of that was driven by the creatives at the studio, despite there being producers and the obvious being counters for game development. But towards the end of Mark's career, the dynamics did change, being a lot more corporate-led, which Mark does admit that there were a lot of mistakes they made with Dreams, especially with it being a console game, and that the pressure was now on to do something that gives people a lot more faith on a console. That's going into what they would do after Dreams, I should say. So he does mention his biggest regret was not having multiplayer in the game on day one. He was referencing things like Roblox or Fortnite, how those just would not work without multiplayer. So they were working on it, and also a PC release, but they just did not get there. They had a lot of it up and running, but for a reason that Mark can't say, it just did not happen. So Mark describes it as not having enough rope anymore, which kind of goes back to what he initially said about Dreams at the start of this conversation, where the success of LittleBigPlanet is what gave them a lot of rope to go off and do Dreams, but by the time they wanted to do multiplayer, PC, things like that, he more or less admits that they ran out of rope. Mark also admits that for him, he wanted Dreams to be more of a LittleBigPlanet 3 or 4 and have Sackboy as a central character, saying that he was more aware at the time of how Sackboy was this iconic character that in a way had this sort of cultural relevance, but he didn't really push for it much internally. So I guess what he's kind of concluding here is that it was more easily cast aside, instead of maybe pushing it more to say, hey, we really need some kind of character to be at the forefront of this thing. And as for the idea of Dreams being a platform where users could eventually sell their creations at the store, or on the PlayStation Store, I should say, he says that that idea did not really get that far, that so many conversations did happen internally, and there were a lot of it, but there were simply too many legal hurdles. So I guess that idea really did not get as far as some maybe were thinking. And that's really, it's interesting to hear. It's frustrating in a way too, because gosh, you hear that and you think, man, Mark, you maybe should have pushed a lot more for Sackboy being a part of this, or just calling it straight up LittleBigPlanet 3 or 4. I guess depends on the release cadence and how Sony was going to line that up. We know that LBP 3 was done by Sumo, so this might have been, say, LBP 4 by the time it shipped. But that's valid. I think Dreams, as incredible as it is, probably did need like an identity to it, right? Not even so much, a game where it's more consumer focused, as in somebody could buy it and actually play it out without, interacting with the creative tools. If they knew this was more of a, reinvention of LittleBigPlanet and what it can really be, because it is transformatively a much different game to what LittleBigPlanet is. But hearing that, it's just like I would have preferred that so much more. That, and just knowing that, so this never really got off the ground to have creators being able to publish separately on the store. I mean, that really was what this thing needed. That, and PC, multiplayer. It's so bizarre, right? Because Sony was willing to let Media Molecule, as Mark says, have this rope to go off and do this very creative, bizarre thing that is creative, creator-led. But at the same time, they don't get the leverage to eventually do all these ambitious ideas that Dreams needs. It's such a frustrating thing to hear in hindsight, that maybe there was a different path here that would have seen Dreams become a lot more successful. Now, something else that also came out of this conversation is Mark talking about Media Molecule's new IP, where you can tell he is being a bit careful in terms of what he says so he doesn't get in trouble. So I think he just kind of double checks. He's like, oh yeah, it's a new IP. I think that's public knowledge now, right? So he doesn't want to let that out there in case it wasn't already known, which it is. But he does say he's not sure exactly what the state of this game is in right now. He's been away from the studio for a year, but he does say that, or at least he describes it it as more of a game than a creative tool. And he also says that Sony still has a lot of faith in the team and what they're doing right now. So that sounds good. Not sure how much faith we can put in that statement, given that, well, one, he's not there anymore, but also the industry's in a very weird place. We know that Media Molecule was more than likely on the chopping block with the recent layoffs and one studio closure that Sony looked at right now, and we're still not really in the safe zone. Obviously, it's very expensive to make games, and it's a very dangerous industry right now, but at least we can say that sounds good to hear. That, and also, I think this was maybe a safe guess, is that they were going to be doing more of a game instead of a creative tool going into their next project. Like, Sony probably is looking at them now and going, you're going to have to do something that we can just straight up sell and market, and it doesn't, talk to more of a niche audience, or at least in a way where we don't have to back it long term to, really support all these ambitious ideas that you're looking to do, or whatever the case is. That kind of, again, falls more on Sony for not footing the bill with something like Dreams, but I am curious as to if this game will have any UGC content in there at all, like any sort of user-generated content, or if it will purely be something like Tearaway, where it's a simple boxed product. It's an experience you can play from start to finish and just kind of, enjoy that for what it is. I would assume that's the case, but it'll be interesting to see if there is any sort of elements in the game that allows users to create things and then publish that for others to interact with. Now, one more really crazy story that came out of this was the initial inception of LBP, where initially this goes back to when it was called Craft World, and they had a prototype of the Yellowhead character running around, and that's, the origins of LBP, what became LBP. And so Mark was talking about how they were pitching this to, at the time, Phil Harrison of Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, and, that pitch went so well that Sony gave them funding for about 6 months, and from what Mark recalls, it was never in writing at that point that Sony was indeed officially bankrolling the whole project, or at least that they were locked in with Sony. He does say that, it must have been in writing, but he doesn't recall, same with Alex Evans, that they don't recall that being like completely locked in legally. So it was something where either just before or right after the GDC demo, Microsoft came knocking, and they were basically looking to poach the entire game. And at least how Mark describes it, it was something where they were out drinking with one of the Microsoft folks, and then towards the end of the night, he's like, oh yeah, by the way, if you want to come with us, we will absolutely get that deal done, which Mark says they technically could have taken them up on that offer, because again, they were certain that they were not actually obligated to work with Sony, but he says they didn't, because that wouldn't have felt right morally. They were pretty sure that they were going to be sticking around with Sony, but yeah, that's one of those cool stories, right, that you don't ever get until a moment like this, where somebody's finally, they've left the studio and they can speak a bit more freely about these things after it's like well past when it happened. So that's always cool, and always goes back to, Microsoft being a company that does like to just try to go out there and get deals done, especially during the 360 life cycle. They were very aggressive doing those kind of deals at the time, right? And so it is something where they, we've got a lot of those instances throughout game history. Next up, we have some new details on PlayStation 5 Pro, where as far as specs go, we know most of what the console is going to be based on what we've heard so far from developer briefings, but the GPU side was still a little bit of a mystery, and now we've got more info on that as well. So these developer briefings were actually seen by Digital Foundry, and so they confirm some things that we already knew, or at least things that we suspected, and they also divulge some new details as well. So they do confirm PS5 Pro has 30 workgroup processors, so that would be a total of 60 CUs. The configuration breakdown for that is 2 shader engines and 4 shader arrays and an 8787 layout, whereas standard PS5's breakdown is 5454, so That confirms the console, while having 60 CUs total, it will have 4 disabled, so that's kind of what we were expecting there. GL2 cache is the same at 4 megabytes, but GL1 cache is doubled to 256, and then GL0V cache doubles to 32. The L0 cache, for what Sony says, is helping ray tracing performance. We're also hearing that the max frequency of the GPU is actually 2.35 gigahertz instead of the assumed 2.18 we've heard so far, which I believe that figure was simply reverse engineered, but directly outlined from Sony. The cap is 235, so the 33 T-flops number that's been floating around technically is not correct. It's 36, although the documentation is suggesting that's simply a maximum cap, and the more expected performance on most experiences is still going to be that 2.18, given this console, like the standard one, does have a set power budget, which is tied directly to the CPU and GPU. So the standard console, we do know, is pretty much always operating on the top end. That's where we always mention it's like a reverse boost clock. But with the Pro, that is not necessarily the case. It just has additional headroom for assumed more taxing situations, depending on the game and the scenario. We're also hearing DirectX 12 Ultimate features are here as well. So as we heard before, VRS is coming. Also mesh shaders. So we're getting a better idea of exactly where the GPU side of this console sits, because so far the only leaks that we had were the T-flops number of 33 and then the 45% metric of it being an improvement over the standard PS5, which that console has a 10 T-flop number, like 10.23 or something, if I remember correctly. But we can see, obviously, it's very non-linear. So, but with that in mind, I mean, there is this, I guess, additional headroom the console does have, which does explain the possibility of how this console was going to play PS5 software through backwards compatibility, because any sort of native PS5 games, the GPU clock speed on standard PS5s is 2.23. So if we assumed it was 2.18, then that would have been an issue, but maybe this now makes a lot more sense. But, you know, with that in mind, we can see just broadly, like, this console is on paper perhaps a more minimal bump, right? It's not quite what we saw with a PlayStation 4 Pro, but you got to figure this thing is probably going to heavily lean into PSSR, as in Sony's going to, you know, when they eventually talk about this machine, spend a lot of time showcasing the performance of PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution to elevate all these 60 FPS target games on the console, so that they can now have a near 4K image quality, or basically look like they're playing in fidelity mode, but you're playing with a higher frame rate. That, or also seeing genuine frame rate bumps for unlocked frame rate games, high frame rate games. So something that is, you know, floating around 80, 90, perhaps we can see PS5 Pro start pushing those games into the upper end and be over 100 more consistently, because, you know, there's simply the matter of CPU-bound games still not really being addressed with this particular console. Although I will argue, if we see more 30 FPS capped games that are more, you know, CPU-bound, you could still have PS5 Pro probably make sure those games consistently hold 30 if they are maybe a little bit uneasy in certain situations where maybe it goes slightly under 30. You're not going to see a game that's like incredibly unstable with the low 20s to where Pro is going to help it considerably, but I mean, it's not like 10% is nothing, so that could still help in theory, depending on the game. Although in the grand scheme of things, not going to be that big of an improvement. But there's also the matter of backwards compatibility in general for the CU count, because that does not divide evenly across the older consoles. So I guess that could potentially be problematic. That's at least how Sony's always approached it, going from PS4 to PS4 Pro and now PlayStation 5. Because they do kind of do it in a way where it's the CU count dividing evenly, setting the clock speed down to those machines to where it, you know, that's how they ensure rich, reliable compatibility. And I can't really speak more on that because clearly there's something going on here to where Sony probably feels confident in being able to adjust it or approach it this way, maybe disabling CUs in backwards compatibility mode for standard PS5 games. I wouldn't really know, but you would have to imagine Sony would not do this without making sure that compatibility is rich and reliable across all games, and you can also enjoy retroactive boosts boost to what would be now base PS4 content, PS4 Pro, or more importantly, standard PS5 titles, because that's really maybe the most exciting thing about PS5 Pro is that for a lot of studios, even if they're not patching these games, you can enjoy a bump on those titles, but also PSSR apparently can still be patched onto PS5 games without having that game running on the latest SDK build, which would be fantastic news, and hopefully we see a lot of studios utilizing that. But so far, that's what we've got with PS5 Pro. Probably not going to hear much else until whenever Sony does eventually talk, or if there's more developer briefings, because we are still probably not going to see Sony say a word about this machine until 1 or 2 months out from when they actually intend on shipping it. Moving on to a very big news story from this past week. We would certainly be remiss to not at least talk about this and how it relates to the PlayStation business long term, but that would be Microsoft, where they're having a very turbulent week. So we'll try and recap this the best that we can here, but this initially kicked off with the announcement of some studio closures and job cuts. So they are closing down Arcane Austin, the development studio behind Redfall and Prey, Tango Gameworks, best known for Hi-Fi Rush, The Evil Within, Ghostwire Tokyo, Alpha Dog Games, that's their mobile studio. Roundhouse Studios is being consolidated into ZeniMax Online Studios. Some jobs within Bethesda Publishing and corporate teams are being cut as well, and according to a report from Jason Schreier writing for Bloomberg, the company is also exploring more cost-cutting by sending voluntary buyout offers to ZeniMax staff. Another report from Tom Warren writing for The Verge mentions that Microsoft has been having internal debates on if Call of Duty new releases should even be put into Game Pass, given that premium sales could be cannibalized by the service. And the company is also considering increasing the price of Game Pass Ultimate again, which we're also hearing in the same article that Senua's Saga Hellblade 2, which launches on May 21st, is also being considered for PS5. Also separately, as an anecdote from Giant Bomb's Jeff Grubb, speaking on the Bombcast, apparently the Perfect Dark game is not in a very good state right now. And to cap all of this off, the Xbox president, Sarah Bond, sat down with Dina Bass on Bloomberg Live to comment publicly on all of this, and she gave, as expected, some kind of non-answers to everything. It's damage control, so, commenting on Hi-Fi Rush, how does a studio that on paper did so well, earned all these rewards, how do they get shut down? And she mentioned that there's, no one size fits all when evaluating a studio and their success, so it really was just not even close to an answer. She did announce that in July they're launching a new mobile store experience via the web, starting with their own first-party games like Candy Crush and Minecraft. When asked about the sales performance of a game like Sea of Thieves on PS5 and how they're doing with releasing games on rival platforms, Bond said that it's the early days and they don't have any data to share, but they say that they've been putting games on other platforms for years, citing Minecraft, Bethesda Game Studios, and Activision Blizzard, which first off, that alone was like, oh my God, you guys are still making this argument. Because we saw this initially with Bethesda and then through the ABK regulator process where they mentioned, oh, we've got multi-platform games. We ship on competing platforms. But it's like, well, no, you bought a third-party publisher that already did that stuff independently of you now owning them. So, I'm sure there's one or two games I'm forgetting, but it's I think the only one that actually would count under their ownership was Minecraft Legends. I'm sure there's surely something I'm missing, but the vast majority of that release output was just there and you became the owner, right? I don't know. I'm wow, I can't believe they're still making that argument. But either way, it's just I don't want to spend too much time on this, although I love talking about these things, even if it's outside of PlayStation. I will say it's something where I did not expect it to just happen this rapidly, right? Which is something had to give with Microsoft eventually, especially with Game Pass, right? So the conversation internally being that maybe Call of Duty games won't even ship on Game Pass. But when you don't have, hardware selling well enough to at least reach new saturation points for Game Pass, since they've primarily saturated with Game Pass, I believe they're still seeing decent growth on PC, but it's a matter of that was not going to keep up for what is a very premium release to where the numbers are going to really pencil out. It just seems like, again, there was this civil war internally. I'm more than certain Xbox did not want this. Well, Xbox leadership, I should say, you know, Matt Booty, Aaron Greenberg, Sarah Bond, Phil, of course. I'm sure they wanted to have autonomy with the brand and stay within the more traditional console space. But it really does seem like this came from the very top down. The CEO, Satya Nadella, the board, the CTO, just trying to deliver better returns to shareholders right on the back of what is coming out of COVID. And many other companies are in a very similar place, right? Like Sony's not isolated from any of this either, where everybody saw this huge rise in the entertainment business from the COVID boom, and everything came crashing back down. You know, Sony did 900 plus layoffs, closing down one of their own studios, canceling a number of projects. Nintendo is still, it's just incredible how they often can navigate these difficult times in the games business to where it seems like nothing is even happening over there. So I wanted to at least acknowledge that they've still done excellent work there. But like, again, many other entertainment businesses have all kind of, you know, come crashing down in their own way with a number of layoffs, and Microsoft is just getting hit harder because they were in third place. They've always been in third place in the console business, you know, with these huge drop-offs year over year with console sales, missing all these huge internal KPIs, Game Pass stagnating. It's like something had to give eventually. I genuinely thought they were going to get a little bit more time now that they picked up all these studios and now two huge full-blown publishers. I was always against how they went about doing it, right? Picking up well-known third-party studios instead of like building new IP organically or building new studios, and like that stuff's always like still very difficult, but I would have preferred that over how they went about doing it. But either way, like now that it happened, it's like, okay, you've got the studios, you've got the IP, like you have everything now that is going to set yourself up for securing the Xbox future. But it's amazing how quick it turned around. We saw even just a few years ago from the ABK regulation process that they were intending on doing exclusivity and things like that, leaning more into the traditional console model, but it really came crashing down so quick to where Microsoft just wants returns from this business, and it really does seem like a civil war. More so with the evidence we have from IGN's Ryan McCaffrey. He put out an article too, talking with former Xbox staff, long-term Xbox staff, that more or less kind of reaffirmed that notion that it seems like it came from the top up and it wasn't necessarily something Phil wanted. But there's just a lot of scrutiny right now on Xbox leadership, and rightfully so, for past comments and what they're doing now. And so there's a lot that can be said, right? I don't want to spend too much time talking on what is primarily an Xbox news story, but at least going back to how this relates to the PlayStation business, I mean, yeah, it very much seems like we're just going to see more and more Xbox releases safely ship on PlayStation. I don't think anything's going to change with ABK. I'm sure Bethesda has the full green light to, start shipping on PlayStation. Exploring something like Senua's Saga, like how is that not going to eventually ship on PlayStation? I mean, they shipped Hi-Fi Rush on PlayStation 5, and somehow they came to the conclusion that game, or rather that studio, is just not worth it. It's terrible, man. It's disappointing. There's so much more I could probably say on this, but I don't want this to be like an overly long news story. It's something where I will say this. I really thought they were going to at least get a little bit of time to start bearing the fruit of all these acquisitions, right? Because they more or less had everything in place now. You look at something like PlayStation 3 as kind of a good example for this, right? Where it's like the console came out, it was bad in a number of ways on paper, like there's no excusing it, but they were able to turn their fortunes around and really change the identity of that console with a lot of game releases. But then you start to realize, like, okay, well, that was a very different time in the games business where you could have 3 Uncharted's and a new IP with The Last of Us all ship within the same cycle a year apart from each other, and basically tons of other studios could do the same release output, and so it's very easy to actually turn it around within one platform cycle. But nowadays games take 4 or 5 years to make, sometimes longer, and so it's like, all right, well, if you want to really change the identity of this brand, build new IP, and that we're talking about 15 something years, 10, 15 years, to see multiple game releases across the same studios and really changing the identity of the platform. And so now it's I guess it becomes a bit more obvious as to why this was probably never going to really pan out for them in the way that would be more the traditional console model. I would have liked to see them still attempt that, but it seems like it's pretty much over. You know, it's more about, let's just start seeing returns from all this stuff that we bought, and the consequence is going to be a lot of hardworking people that even made fantastic video games, and that wasn't enough. Moving on to our next news story, and somewhat related news here, we can also mention that game subscription is still basically stalled. It's not growing. This comes from Matt Piscatella of Circana, tracking video game sales data in the US. And so he was actually, quote, retweeting some industry data from last year about video game subscription spending in the US. And that tweet at the time was from June 7th, 2023, mentioning that April 2023 spending was only up 2% compared to April 2022. And so he, quote, retweets this saying that it's still stalled. March 2024 non-mobile video game subscription spending is only up 1% versus April 2023. So again, it's not declining, but it's also not getting bigger. So really kind of goes back to, you know, Game Pass and how that's just, at this point, I actually would be surprised if they do end up doing Call of Duty on Game Pass. Maybe part of the studio closures was to justify that. I don't know. That would be tough to sort of you would think they would look at all that stuff before actually acquiring ABK, but again, totally separate thing. The PS Plus side of things, that's, well, we knew how Sony was going about this anyway. They weren't necessarily concerned with growing PlayStation Plus in the same way Microsoft was, when they were very open about how they were just not going to do day one releases. Like, straight up, Jim Ryan at the time, when he was still with the company, it's just financially doesn't work for us, we're not doing it. And it's more about extracting more money out of the same users. Like, that's the only way that it makes sense for them. So game subscription was not the future, and it's a part of the business, and I would be hard pressed to say it's ever going to be anything more than that. Next up, we have a minor update for The Last of Us HBO, where, as expected, we now have some shots of them filming in Vancouver for Seattle, the Seattle portions of The Last of Us Part 2. So a lot of cool shots being taken out there, showing some of the scenes that they're setting up, right? We also got some video of the WLF as well. Really cool. I don't think there's anything so far seen from the Seraphites, but man, it's getting me very excited. You know, I think they're probably, because we know this is not going to be just all one season. It's going to be at least 2 seasons. So you have to assume they're probably filming everything. They're filming as much as they can for even the upcoming season. So, certain shots where it makes sense. If they do go for that sort of back and forth timeline that the game had, that they're probably filming the seasons concurrently. Things that they're capturing right now might only be seen in season 3. But yeah, we did see those this past week, and we'll probably see even more very soon. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the news stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all, and our Monday video was looking at the Helldivers 2 controversy, so if you want to get brought up to speed on exactly what went down, you can go check that out. But otherwise, we will have another upload normally on Tuesday if it's not some kind of breaking news story. I do know that if we see the announcement of the PlayStation Showcase, we'll probably have an upload right away talking about that, doing some predictions and whatnot, but otherwise, that is it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.